Hi guys, and welcome back to another true crime and makeup time video. If you're new here, my name is Zara and I post a new true crime video every single week. So if you love makeup and you love true crime, what are you waiting for? Definitely join the fam, hit that subscribe button, and leave me a comment down below saying hi if you're new here. Now, today's case is so interesting, guys. A lot of you guys have been requesting for more positive stories. So I've been looking into a few more survival stories, and this one is crazy. Although this case may not begin that way, just the strength and courage people can have, especially at a young age, to me is very inspiring. It's rare for someone to cross paths with a murderer and live to tell the tale, but Crystal Searles was definitely one of the lucky ones. In 1999, when she was 10 years old, she crossed paths with a serial killer named Tommy Lynn Sells, and she survived. Let's get into it. So first, let's talk about this sicko. His name was Tommy Lynn Sells, and he was responsible for over 70 murders across the United States, and they nicknamed him the Coast to Coast Killer. Now, Tommy was born in Oakland, California on 28th June 1964, and he had a twin sister named Tammy Lynn. His mother, Nina, was a single mom, and she had three other children already when Tommy and his sister Tammy were born. When he was 18 months old, well, him and his sister, the entire family moved to St. Louis, Missouri. And around that time, him and his sister, they both contracted meningitis. Now, there's many types of meningitis, I believe, and him and his sister, they contracted the type that was spinal, so spinal meningitis. But for those that don't know, it's a pretty dangerous disease and it really has a low survival rate, I believe. And his sister, his twin sister, Tammy Lynn, she didn't survive the disease and she passed away at 18 months old. If you guys don't know what meningitis is, it's like something that most parents worry about because it's really dangerous for kids. And I think the most common type is viral meningitis, and spinal meningitis is an infection of the fluid and the membranes at the back, like at the base of the spine. And I believe meningitis goes into the brain. So once it's in the brain, it basically spreads so quickly that it's really hard to survive. Without treatment, and because it spreads so fast, it can cause brain damage and be fatal within just 24 hours. And I believe it's usually a type of bacteria or virus that causes this condition. It's really bad. So I didn't find a reason for why, but after he contracted the meningitis and he recovered from it, Tommy was actually then sent to live with his aunt Bonnie. So he lived with her till he turned 5 years old. And then around that time, his Aunt Bonnie was like, okay, I want to permanently adopt Tommy. And then his mother was like, no. So then Tommy went back and lived with his mother. So I don't even know why he was sent to live with his aunt for that long, but maybe his mom couldn't cope or something like that. But then eventually at 5, he moved back in with his mom. Now, when he moved back in with his mom, he was kind of just left by himself. His mom wasn't very motherly. He kind of just had to look after himself. And I mean, what does a kid really know about looking after themselves? They don't. He had to be responsible for most of his own life. And because of that, by the age of 7, he already stopped attending school and he began drinking at 7. Now, can you guys imagine what drinking will do to a developing brain? Then when he was 8, there was a man from a nearby town. His name was Willis Clark, and he began hanging around Tommy and spending quite a bit of time with him. Willis showed him a lot of attention and he would take him out and shower him with gifts and pay a lot of attention to him. We know where this is headed. Clearly grooming him. And because he was left to his own accord, Tommy, on multiple nights, would go and spend the night with Willis. So he began molesting Tommy. And what was really hard for me to even understand and read was Willis, began molesting Tommy with his own mother's consent. His own mom allowed Willis to do this to Tommy. I mean, why? What was her reason? What was her motivation? So this period in his life obviously affected Tommy really badly, and Later on, Willis was arrested and he was convicted of child molestation. Now, although he was slowly not going to school from the age of 7 and began drinking, at the age of 10, he stopped going to school altogether and began smoking weed instead. From ages 10 to 13, Tommy was good at one thing, and that was staying in trouble. I mean, why wouldn't he be, Like with that type of upbringing, they don't really have a chance. Now, Tommy and his mom kind of stayed clashing, and at the age of 13, he climbed into his grandmother's bed naked. His mom was like, I'm done. That was her last straw with him. So within days of this happening, she packs up all her belongings, all her other 3 children's belongings, and leaves. Just leaves. She didn't tell him where she was going, how long she was going for, and she didn't even tell him she was leaving. She just left him, a 13-year-old boy all by himself. So now he's 13 years old, homeless, a homeless teenager, and he decides, I'm just going to travel across the United States. And that's what he did. From 1978 to 1999, he just traveled all around the US. Now, during this time, throughout his travels, he continued his bad behavior. He drank heavily and he abused a lot of drugs. He had no home, no family, and he just would drift from town to town, picking up odd jobs and stealing whatever he needed to survive. He took on short-term manual labor jobs, and he also took up barber jobs, and he went to jail in and out various times for various crimes. Now, he was filled with a lot of rage after his mom abandoned him, and he would take out his rage on women. And during this time, he attacked his first victim, a female, by pistol whipping her until she was unconscious. Later on, he admits that he committed his first murder at the age of 16 when he broke into a home and he saw this man who was performing oral sex on a little boy, and he killed that man. There was never any proof to back up this claim, but he still stuck to that story. He also claimed to have shot and killed a man in 1979 named John Cade Sr. when he caught Tommy breaking into his home. Then in May 1981, when he was 17 years old, he moves back to Arkansas, Little Rock, and moves back in with his mom and his siblings. But this reunion with his mom and his siblings was super short-lived because when they were living together, his mom's taking a shower. His mom, Nina, she's taking a shower. So he gets undressed, goes into the shower, climbs in with her, and attempts to have sex with her. His mom. Again, she was like, done. Get out. She kicked him out and said, just don't come back. So now he's back on the streets. He goes back to what he knows best, and that's robbing, killing, and stealing. He was working at the carnival as a casual laborer, and he would just hop the train city to city. He later confessed to killing 2 more people in Arkansas before moving back to St. Louis in 1983. And out of this, only one of the murders, the victim's name was Hal Akins, was confirmed. In May 1984, he was convicted of a car theft, and then he was sentenced to prison, I think 2 years in prison. And the following February, less than 2 years, he was released from prison, but he failed to follow the terms of his probation. Then he's in Missouri and he begins working at a county fair. And at this fair, he meets a woman. This woman was Ina Court and her son, and she was 35 at the time. And Tommy claims he killed her. And honestly, his crimes are very brutal. And again, you guys know me with kids. It's just really upsetting to me. But he was with Ina, and he claims he comes back home and he catches her going through his backpack. So he takes a baseball bat and he beats her to death with it. Then she had a son, a 4-year-old son named Rory, and he was standing right there. He was the only witness to the crime. So he takes the baseball bat and he does the same thing to this poor 4-year-old boy. And their bodies were discovered 3 days later, and he had already fled. By September 1984, he was 20 at this point, he was already back in jail. And this time he was back in jail for drunk driving. So he stays in jail until May 1986. And then he goes back to St. Louis and he claims that he shot a stranger there. Then he goes to Texas where he's hospitalized for a heroin overdose. And once he's out of the hospital, he steals a car and heads to California. I mean, already at this point, he needed to just be in jail. He didn't need to be on the streets. How many murders is that? Like, I can't even count. Like over 7? And he's only 20. 20. It's even wild to think that people live like this. People actually live just like committing crimes and moving along the place. And it's like, he's not going to stop because even though he's going to jail, he's just like, well, what else can I do? He just keeps doing the same thing. During this time, investigators believe he was responsible for 2 more deaths, which he doesn't really acknowledge. One was Jennifer Dewey, who was 20 when she was shot to death. And then the other was Michelle Xavier, who was 19, and she was found with her throat. So now in 1987, he's now living in Nevada with this woman named Stephanie Stroh. So now she's only 20 at this point, and he claims that he drugged her with LSD and then strangled her to death and weighed her body down with concrete and then dumped her in a hot spring in the desert. However, this crime was never confirmed. Tommy says he then leaves Nevada and goes to New York now. And in New York, he confesses to killing another woman named Suzanne Corks, who was 27 years old. He's just all over the place, killing people. So now the next murders are really horrific, so I'm warning you now. The next person to come across Tommy's path, and this ended up being quite a well-known case, was Keith Dardeen. And on the 18th of November 1987, Keith spots Tommy hitchhiking in Illinois. So Keith invites him over to his mobile home for a hot meal and just to lend out a helping hand. Keith was 29 and he had a wife named Elaine and a 3-year-old boy. His son's name was Peter, and he invites Tommy over and then they go to his mobile home. In return, to thank Keith for his hospitality, Tommy shoots him. He then mutilates his penis and then abandons him in a nearby field. Oh my God. Next, he murders his 3-year-old son, Peter, by bludgeoning him to death with a hammer. Then he turns his rage onto his poor pregnant wife, Elaine, who he attempted to... Guys, this next part, like... Ugh. So the attack caused Elaine to freak out, obviously. She must have been quite far along in her pregnancy. Oh my God. And it caused her to go into early labor and give birth to their daughter. They were going to name this poor baby girl Casey. And neither Elaine nor her newborn daughter Casey survived Tommy's wrath. Tommy beat the both of them to death with a bat. Oh my God. He then assaulted Elaine. I can't even believe I'm saying this. He then assaulted Elaine with the bat after she gave birth. What is going on with the world sometimes? Like, it's just, oh my God. Okay, and then he tucks the 2 dead children into bed and leaves. I don't want to talk about that anymore. Like, he is such a sick, twisted, like, who does that? How does that even happen? Who thinks of these things? How can you even do something like this? It's just horrific sometimes, the world that we live in. And I'm not going to get emotional, but it's just disgusting, some people that we have on this earth. Like, ugh. So news of these killings, I mean, can you imagine the horror? Like the horror of even having to talk about something like this, let alone know that it happened in your freaking neighborhood. But the news of these killings just made the neighborhood so afraid, as it would, and they were just on high alert from this. Many residents began like traveling with their shotguns super visible because they were just like, don't mess with me. And this was a huge case. The crime went unsolved for 12 years until Tommy eventually confessed. But I know it's a brutal case, but if you guys are interested, you can type in Keith Dardeen and the whole story comes up. So I pretty much summed it up, but if you're interested. So during a time where he was in prison for theft in 1990, Tommy had begun seeing a psychiatrist, and he was diagnosed with a personality disorder and a substance abuse disorder where he had to depend on alcohol, opioids, drugs, amphetamines, all of that to just survive. Tommy also suffered from major depressive disorder, psychosis, and bipolar disorder, and he was just a very dangerous, deranged man. He was not someone that you needed to cross paths with. He was deeply troubled. In 1992, Tommy found himself homeless, and he was standing beneath a bridge holding a sign saying, "We'll work for food." I mean, imagine another person helped him then. He would have just probably freaking killed them. And as you can imagine, a sympathetic young woman, I believe she was 19 at the time, she saw his sign, she saw him, and she felt sorry for him. So she's like, okay, come back to my house. I'll offer you a meal. And I can't believe people even, like, nobody would do that now, and for good reason, but she did. So she brings him back to her house and she tells him, just wait outside while I prepare you a meal. But obviously, because it's Tommy, he enters her home, grabs a knife from her kitchen, and then proceeds to trap her in her own bedroom. Now, she apparently did fight back as much as she could, and she even attacked him or threw a ceramic duck at him, but he was able to overpower her. He raped her, stabbed her 18 times, and then bludgeoned her. He was actually caught and charged with her murder, but somehow, I don't know what was going on, he was able to secure a plea deal that would only sentence him to 5 years in prison. How? Because he's got a history of murder, a history of attacks, a history of violence, and he's able to secure a plea deal of 5 years. What is wrong with the justice system? I mean, we all know what's wrong with it. So during this prison stint, he meets a woman and he ends up marrying her while he's still in prison. And then when he's released in 1997, he goes on to live with her. Literally after he's released from this 5-year prison sentence, okay? Literally right after it, he goes on to commit these next crimes. So in 1997 alone, he attacks Julia Ree Harper and stabs 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick to death. He then kidnaps and strangles to death a 13-year-old girl named Stephanie Mahoney. In 1999, he rapes and murders Debbie Harris and Ambria Harris, who was 8. He then rapes and strangles a 9-year-old Mary Perez. He then rapes and murders Haley McCone, who was 13, and then goes on to sell her bike for $20. He's then jailed again for drunk and disorderly conduct, and then he shoots and kills a 14-year-old boy named Bobby Wofford. All of that, okay, in 2 years after he's released from prison. Courts really messed up on that one. Those poor people, their poor families. I can't even imagine how they must be feeling knowing that this guy should have been in jail for all that time. And if he had been, he would have never been able to commit any of these crimes. But he was released. So many small children had to die. And I don't know what his issue is with small kids. I mean, he had an issue with his mom. So why are you killing all these kids? Like, it's just, he's like one of the worst people I've ever heard of. So that was just his background. Okay, that was just his background, because now that brings us to the next crime. On December 30th, 1999, at a home in Del Rio, Texas, 2 girls were just super excited about having a sleepover together. 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, who went by Katie, and 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Now, 10-year-old Crystal, she had a younger sister named Marquis, I think, or Mark, I think that's how you say it. And the 2 of them were actually staying with Katie's parents at her house, because her parents, Crystal's and Mark's, were out of town because they were preparing to move to Del Rio, Texas. They were originally from Kansas, and they were just back in Kansas preparing their house for the move to Texas. Crystal's mom, Pam, she left the girls with Katie's family and Katie because she felt it was good for the girls to make new friends and just meet new people, especially as they were about to move there. Now, Crystal and Mark, I'm going to call her Mark, they were like most sisters. They just didn't get along that well, but they would fight and make up quite often. Like, obviously, they loved each other, but Crystal just saw Mark as like this annoying little sister. Katie, she was a super beautiful girl and she was really well liked in school. She did all the normal things that young girls do growing up, and she had great plans for her future. She had older siblings, two brothers, Sean and Justin, and a sister named Lori, and she was the youngest. She had recently become friends with Crystal and Mark because they had just moved, or I guess they were like scoping out the area because they hadn't moved yet, but I guess they already had a home there. And she was super excited about the sleepover too. I mean, there were girls closer to her age and she didn't just have to hang out with her siblings, you know? Now, they weren't the only ones in the house during the sleepover that day. Katie's mother and the siblings were there. Her father was actually in Kansas with Crystal and Mark's parents helping them move. So he was a really nice neighbor. They were super excited about the sleepover, but the girls were unaware that for one of them, this would be their final night. Now, like many young girls, their sleepover just basically consisted of everything that young girls do. They played dress up, they watched movies, they ate popcorn, they sang, they danced, they just had a good time. They just laughed and played all night long. So when it finally came time to sleep, Mark was so excited and so desperate to just join Crystal and Katie. And she was like, I want to sleep in your room. And Crystal was like, hell no, you're not going to sleep in my room. You know what it's like with a younger sibling? You're like, please don't cramp my style. Like, you go over there and I'll go over here. And that's what it was like for them. So that night, Mark wasn't allowed to sleep in the same room as Crystal and Katie, and she ended up sleeping in the room directly opposite the girls, in like opposite the hallway. Now, because of this little altercation that Crystal and Mark had, Mark was in the bedroom across the hall, like raging, super angry because she just thought she was missing out on having all this fun that she thought that the two girls were probably having. And she was like, what are they doing in there? Like, why am I here by myself? And she didn't go to sleep for nearly 2 hours. The room that Crystal and Katie slept in was a room with bunk beds. And Crystal slept on the top bunk and Katie slept on the bottom. And Crystal and Mark's mum, Pam, she's in a whole different state. And she was pretty nervous about her girls not staying like with her that night, as most parents would be. But she was also happy that her girls were having an experience and being with people and just getting to know new people. And at the same time, she was also happy just having a night to herself. At 6 a.m. the next morning, Pam gets a call that would just change her entire life. Now, because the phone rang at such a weird time, so early, she was wondering who's calling me at this hour. And immediately you kind of think it's about your kids, right? Because they're not with you. When she answered the phone, she immediately gets told that her daughter, Crystal, was in the hospital and she was fighting for her life. They told her to get there immediately. Now, Texas Ranger Johnny Allen, he got the call about half an hour before Pam was notified. He had been told that there was a violent attack at the Harris household, which is Katie's house. He knew right away that this was probably a very serious situation because there were kids involved, and he hops in his car and he gets there right away. When he got there, he found out that 13-year-old Kayleen Harris, Katie, had been brutally stabbed to death. So what the hell happened that night? Crystal and Katie are sleeping in their room after a fun night. They're having a sleepover, a normal thing that young kids do. They stayed up pretty late, and eventually when they went to bed, they must have just knocked out. And Crystal, at about 3:50 a.m., she wakes up to the sound of someone screaming. Now, like I said, she was on the top bunk and she heard the sound coming from beneath her. And normally, I mean, you know, at least me, I would freak out too. I would jump up, but she kind of stayed fairly calm and she just looks and tries to figure out what's going on. So instead of hopping out of bed, maybe she was afraid, maybe she was just smart. Instead of hopping out of the bed, she just leans over the bunk bed and looks down to see what's going on. She never sat up, and the lights at this point were turned on. At the end of the bed was a man that she had never seen before, and he had long, curly, scruffy hair and a big beard. And this beard apparently took over her whole face. And can you imagine what the hell she was thinking? Like, you're literally sleeping. You're literally sleeping. You had a sleepover, like just a fun, innocent night. And then there's this stranger at the bottom of your bed, a stranger that looks like that nonetheless. His eyes were dark and mean, and she could see that he had Katie on the floor beneath him. She couldn't really tell exactly what was going on, but she could just tell that Katie was struggling with him. At this point, Crystal was pretty scared, but she didn't want to make any noise in case the man would notice her. At that point, she was like, this guy doesn't even know I'm here, and she didn't know what to do. She then sees that Katie has blood on her, and this man, he's holding a knife. The knife came out of nowhere, and this man puts his hands over Katie's mouth, and then he grabs the knife and he throat. Crystal's just watching in horror, nothing she can do as Katie falls to the ground. At this point, he was so enthralled and mesmerized, focused on what he was doing to Katie, that he didn't even notice Crystal on the top bunk. Now, this man, he looked to be in a rage, like in a trance nearly, and Crystal didn't want him to notice her on the top bunk, so she stayed hidden. Then the man slowly walks to the entrance to the room, the door, and he looks like he's about to just switch the light off. And this is so creepy, but as he's about to turn the light off, he just suddenly turns and looks at Crystal on the top bunk. His eyes met Crystal's, and she just knew, I'm next. So now he's seen her and he's like, I can't leave. She knows what I look like. And she tries to get away from him by crawling to the other side of the bed, but he grabs her and he does the exact same thing he does to her friend Katie, using the same knife to her throat. He did it like no big deal, super quick. Then he walks out. As he does, he turns off the light and he shuts the door behind him. Crystal just lay there as he did so. And then next, I don't know how she did what she did, but she pulls herself up and she manages to crawl down from the bunk bed to help her friend Katie. So she sees Katie and hears Katie making these gasping noises and choking noises, and she tries to comfort her and let her know that, as much as she can, that it's okay and she's there. And as she's trying to tell Katie this, as she's trying to tell her, it's okay, she realizes she can't speak because her throat had been. Katie then soon stops making the noise. There was blood everywhere, and she realized that she had gone. Crystal realizes then she's also losing a lot of blood. She was bleeding everywhere, and that she needed to get help immediately or she was going to die. So she heads across the hall to Mark's room, and Mark's there sleeping untouched, and she says that she tried to wake her up, but she couldn't because she couldn't speak. But I was like, couldn't you shake her awake or something? But she couldn't. So then she decides she needs to leave the house because she was afraid that this guy was still in the house and maybe killing the rest of the family. She had no idea where he was and she didn't want to get attacked again. So she slowly and quietly makes her way out of the house. She has no shoes on. She's still in her pajamas. And she just sees a light in the distance and she's like, okay, I'm going to head in that direction. She makes it to the road and the light is a quarter mile away. And she said, okay, if I can just get to this house, it's going to be okay. Let's just try and get to this house. As she approached the house, she walks up, goes to the front door, and she bangs and bangs on the door. And a man goes, who is it? Who is it? But she's unable to speak, so she just continues banging on the door. When the man finally opens the door, he's like, can't even believe what he's seeing because there's just this girl holding her throat, blood everywhere, and he's just in disbelief. To make the situation worse, she can't even speak and tell him what's going on. So he gives her a notepad, I'm guessing, and she writes on it, the Harrises are hurt. Tell them to hurry. She then writes next, my neck is hurt. Will I live? And apparently there was just blood dripping onto the notepad, and for the man, it was like heartbreaking to see because he didn't know she was going to make it. He immediately calls 911 and he quickly brings her like into the house, I think, because she must have been in the house when she wrote the note. But he brings her in because he doesn't know if this man is still out there lurking, like waiting to get her. So the Texas Rangers immediately make their way to this home. They discover Katie's body in the room. It's a horrible crime scene covered in blood, and sadly, Katie, she didn't survive. Meanwhile, Mark remembers waking up and she sees the sun coming in through the window, and she sees a woman that she didn't recognize sitting at the edge of her bed, and this woman hands her a tank top and some shorts and tells her, okay, we need to hurry, we need to leave. As she's leaving the room, she opens the door, and remember, their bedroom was right across the hall, and she just sees like streaks of blood from Katie and Crystal's bedroom, and she knew someone was hurt, and she's there without her family, only her sister, and she's like, where's my sister? You know, where's my family? She's so young. It must have been so terrifying. When Mark finally finds out what had happened, she ends up saying that if it was her that had stayed in that room, she probably wouldn't be here today because there's no way she could have survived what had happened. Hours later, Crystal wakes up in the hospital and she's just connected to all these tubes and bandaged up. But she was alive, guys. And she remembers her mom, Pam, with her and just like stroking her hair and telling her it's all going to be okay. You know, I'm here. When Pam initially got the call, Crystal's mom, when they told her that Crystal was attacked, they also told her, we need your permission to fly her to this other hospital to give her the care that she needs because the attack is quite vicious. They then tell her that Crystal's throat had been cut, and that's all they tell her. So she had no idea like whether she sustained any other injuries or what was going to happen to her daughter. Crystal later finds out that the blade had nicked her vocal cords, and that's why she had been unable to talk. Eventually her voice came back and she asks, you know, how's Katie? Like, how's she doing? And obviously when they told her what had happened, she was devastated, like traumatized. Now, as sad as she was about Katie's death, she knew the only way to sort of recover from this is to regain all my strength and tell the police as much as I can about this man. As soon as she started to feel just a little bit better, she was able to give a full description of this man as well as help come up with a sketch. Crystal stated that she could not get this man's image out of her head, and when the sketch was done, she couldn't believe how accurate it was, how much it looked like him. So the police went to work quickly with all their resources and they put together, you know, possible suspects that they believed could have done this, and they set up a bunch of photos in front of Crystal for a lineup, and they're like, can you identify the man who did this? Crystal immediately points to the photo of Tommy Lynn Sells. It was him. I mean, how incredible is she to remember details like that when you've been attacked like that? It's wild. I mean, I feel like I would just be too panicked, you know, like to be able to point him out and not be afraid. She really was an incredible little girl. Now, after Crystal picks him out from the lineup, the police know who they're looking for and they immediately get to work. So the hospital that Crystal was airlifted to was the San Antonio Hospital. So from there, the police, they then make their way back to Del Rio where the crime took place. And it was around 5:30 a.m. when they knocked on Tommy's door, and it was unlocked and he wasn't answering the door. So they walked right in and they saw him just standing there in the hallway. He looks at them and simply says, I'm tired of doing this. I'm glad I got caught. They arrested him for murder and they tell him, this time you're going to be spending the rest of your life behind bars. I mean, look, I'm glad he was caught, but how annoying if he was in jail and he could have not have committed this in the first place, but okay. The murder weapon was an 11-inch butcher's knife, and it was so thin because it had been sharpened so many times. It was thrown away in the bush right behind his house, exactly where he told the police he got rid of it. And once they arrested him, the police They call Pam and they tell her that they made an arrest of the man who harmed her daughter. Now, Pam was happy knowing that the man who had attacked her daughter was behind bars and could no longer, attack her daughter. But Crystal, she was still not happy. She felt empty. She felt unfulfilled. She was like, okay, well, it's good that he's captured and he can't harm anyone else, but my friend is still dead. Everyone kept telling her how brave she was, how strong she was, that she helped capture this guy and he can no longer hurt anyone. But she just kind of felt like, I'm not brave. I just got lucky. I believe she had this tremendous guilt that we were both attacked, both Katie and I, but I survived and Katie didn't. She just had guilt that why her? Why did she manage to survive this? When Tommy gave his confession, he stated that on the night of the murder, he was just around the area, and he saw that a window had been left open. So that's how he was able to gain access. He was easily able to enter the home. And the first room he actually walked into was that of Mark's. And he sees Mark there, laying there, sleeping. But he was like, nah, I'm going to try another room. And that's when he entered Crystal and Katie's room. He said he walked into that room, approached Katie, cut her bra and underwear off and anything else that she was wearing, and then proceeded to stab her. He said as he stabbed her, she jumped, and that's when he cut her throat. He then describes as he was leaving, he saw Crystal up on the top bunk, and then he demonstrated her throat to the court. At first, they believed that the motive was sexual assault, but then they find out that Sells, Tommy, actually was associated, knew the Harris family, and he had specifically targeted Katie, hence going to Mark's room and then not her, and then going to Katie's room. Apparently, the Harris family met Tommy at church, and they would all regularly attend church. They struck up a friendship, and Tommy had actually been to the house prior. He knew the layout of the house, and he knew how to slip in and out and attack Katie without disturbing anyone else, which I wonder why the mom and the siblings didn't hear Katie scream. On his way to jail, he says to the police, I guess you want to know about the other murders. And that's when everything was spilling, and that's when they found out about all the other victims. He obviously now had the police's attention, and he was interrogated for hours. During this interrogation, he confessed to 22 murders. The police were in full shock because they had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer. During the interrogation process, he makes a statement saying, my daddy told me dead men tell no tales. And he said it while smiling, and which creeped the detectives out. And following that is when he went to trial and Crystal testified against him. Now, you would think that Crystal was pretty afraid of him after what he did to her. I mean, it wasn't just a simple attack. It was a full-on attempted murder. And she stated that she felt fine knowing that she was going to see him during the trial. She wasn't afraid. She said it was a bit different because she knew that he couldn't get her this time, and she knew that what she was doing was going to put him away. She had the power this time around, and she even asked her mom, when I take the stand, Mom, please don't cry. She believed that this probably was going to distract her, and she didn't want any distractions. She wanted to even walk past Tommy and look him in the eyes. She said she wasn't scared of him and that she was doing it for Katie. When Crystal was asked who attacked her that night and who murdered Katie, she had to look at him and point directly at him. And when she did so, she stated that he wouldn't look at her. He just sat there looking down, shaking his leg. And I mean, as you can imagine, at one point, she became so overwhelmed she couldn't answer any more questions. So they ended up taking a 15-minute break. Crystal, she sat there, she got her shit together essentially, and then she just went right back out there and continued. She had to show her neck scar to the jury, and then she had to demonstrate how she popped her her head up from the bunk bed, and, had to watch what was going on. It must have been really hard for her to relive all of that at just 10 years old. The defense attorney couldn't even say anything. He couldn't even question her. All he said was, you're a brave young woman. No further questions. Crystal stated that this made her super happy because knowing that the person who was there solely to defend this dickhead was on her side. She said the moment it was over and the moment she stepped off the stand, she felt so good. She felt this huge relief, like this pressure was just off her shoulders. After an hour and 10 minutes of deliberation, the jury returns with a verdict for Tommy Sells, and they found him guilty of capital murder. They then tried to get the death penalty for him, so the jury goes back, deliberates again, and then they sentenced Tommy to death. For the next couple of years after the attack, Crystal and her mom and her family, all of them, they all slept in the same room because they were so afraid. While most of her family slept, Crystal said she would wake up normally at 5 a.m. and she would just have her eyes wide open, and she had this game plan. If someone comes through the window, I know exactly what I'm going to do. She was just prepared. She would also check her family throughout the night to make sure they were breathing. You know, like that's the effects of these kinds of things happening to people. I mean, it's trauma, and it leaves a scar on you. Her sister Mark feels like the thing that Crystal struggles with the most is the fact that even though Tommy, was sentenced to death and he got caught, Crystal still struggles with the fact that she survived and Katie died. Nothing was going to change that fact. It had been done. In 2016, 17 years after the attack, a random stranger named Alvin Willie George began sending Crystal horrific things like pictures from the bloody crime scene and a lot of threats, threatening to kill and rape her and kill her family. Just horrible things. Who does that? Luckily, this guy was caught and he was sentenced to 4 years in jail for cyber stalking. I mean, people are just weirdos. Who does this? What does that do for your life? Crystal says that she never thinks of Tommy, refuses to think about him. She never wants to give him the time of day. In an interview, she made a statement saying, "It makes me really thankful. That's what he did. He didn't ever bring me down at all. These are happy tears. I'm just glad to be here, be alive." Crystal is such a brave woman. I mean, me, as a 10-year-old, let me tell you, that wouldn't have been me. Tommy was such a dangerous man, and I wonder what made his attack on Crystal different to his other victims. Was it a different attack? Was he just like lazy? Was he shocked that there was someone else in the room with Katie? Was it just Crystal's will to survive that made her a survivor? I mean, not to discount the other victims, but I mean, he had done this multiple times and none of them survived. What I find the most inspiring about this case is although Tommy Sells took so many lives, so many innocent lives, so many men, women, children in such a horrific way. And not only did he take all these lives, he did these horrific things. Like that story about the pregnant woman, like will forever live with me as one of the worst things I've ever heard in my life. But when you look up the name Tommy Lynn Sells, you don't just see the crimes he committed, you see Crystal's name right up there with him. She overpowered him really and ended up leaving this legacy of this little girl who put an end to a mass serial killer. It's really crazy. I mean, the thing is, we don't know what the future holds and what type of criminals. I mean, we're always going to have criminals, right? But we need something in this world, man, to like not have these type of people in it, Ugh. Let me know your thoughts on today's case, guys. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I look forward to seeing you in the comments. Besitos. Mwah. Bye.